This man calls 911, but when the cops arrive, they open the coffin. It was late at night, and he calls 911 to ask for help with locked coffin. What happened next changed my whole life. Sam barely contains his tears as he stared out the window at the policeman who pulled him over. His daughter's life was on the line, and his only hope of saving her was to get rid of this nosy cop. "We should do this again when Mom gets home from her business trip, right?" Sam grinned down at his teenage daughter, Tamara. "Definitely," Tamara replied. "She'll love the performer with the poodles." Father and daughter exited the carnival. They had a great day and planned to spend their Saturday evening watching a movie. They had a friendly argument about which movie to watch as they approached the car. "Spy movies are lame, Dad," Tamara said. "I want to watch a comedy or the newest superhero movie." Sam sighed. "Not another superhero movie. What about an action movie?" "Change of plans. Neither of you will be watching movies tonight," said a man with a gruff voice. Sam turned toward the voice and looked into the barrel of a gun. The strange man grabbed Tamara. "We're going for a ride, just the three of us. You," he gestured to Sam, "get behind the wheel." Sam's heart thumped like a drum. He met Tamara's gaze and saw how frightened she was. But what could Sam do? The man had a gun. "I don't want your car." The man opened the back door and shoved Tamara inside. "I need a ride home to Baltimore. Take me there and I'll let you and your daughter go. Refuse and you'll never leave this parking lot alive." "Okay," said Sam, raising his hands. He had no option but to comply with the threatening man, so he climbed behind the wheel and started the car. "There we go, nice and easy," the gunman said from the back seat. He told Sam the address where he should go in Baltimore. "And remember, so as long as you do what I say, nobody's going to get hurt." Sam's hands were slick with sweat as he navigated through Washington, D.C. He avoided the most congested roads and soon was on the road to Baltimore. It wasn't far, and he hoped he'd soon be able to drop this crazy man off and escape with Tamara. God, he couldn't believe this was happening. Sam looked into the rearview mirror, and his heart clenched at the sight of Tamara's fear-stricken face. She'd barely made a sound all this time, but Sam could see she was on the verge of tears. Sam swore when he turned his gaze back to the road ahead. The police had set up a roadblock. "Pull over," the gunman said. "I didn't get this far just to be caught by the cops." Sam quickly complied. He was almost overcome by joy. The man was leaving, and now he and Tamara would be safe. The gunman had other plans. Once Sam pulled over, the man ordered him to open the trunk. "Me and your girl will ride in the trunk from this point, where it's nice and safe," the gunman glared at Sam. She looked pleadingly at Sam, but what choice did he have? The gunman was insane, a hardened criminal or both. He didn't want to lock his daughter up in the trunk with him, but if he refused, Sam didn't even want to imagine what would happen then. "Be strong, Tamara," Sam said as he popped the trunk. "Everything'll be okay." Tamara's face crumpled as she finally gave in to her fear. Her shoulders heaved as she began to sob. Sam reached for her, but the gunman pointed the gun at him. "Back off," he barked. "Nothing's going to happen to her unless you mess up." A few minutes later, Sam drove toward the roadblock with a prayer on his lips. The cop standing in the road waved at the car 2 places ahead of him to carry on driving. The cop also waved through the next car. Sam was beginning to think he and Tamara might survive this night, but then the cop waved him off to the side. "I was going to let you go, but now you got the cops involved." For a few desperate seconds, Sam considered ramming his foot down on the gas and speeding away. Then common sense kicked in. He wouldn't get far if he tried to escape the cops, and the crazy gunman would instantly know something was wrong. Sam pulled over, and a moment later, a different policeman appeared at his window. Sam had already taken his license and registration papers out and thrust them toward the policeman before he could ask for them. "Well, this shouldn't take long, sir." The policeman glanced through his papers. He then peered into the back seat. "Everything seemed fine so far. Open the trunk and you'll soon be on your way." Sam's mouth dried up. He cleared his throat and tried to think of a convincing reason to refuse the officer's request. The gunman could possibly hear everything from the trunk, and Sam would have to choose his words carefully. Rick had served as a police officer for 10 years. His hard work and good instincts earned him several promotions during that time. Right now, his instincts told him something was very wrong with the man crying in the car. He raised his hand and signaled to James, his fellow officer, to keep quiet. He then took out his notebook and wrote down a message for the driver. "Is somebody in the trunk?" The driver whimpered as he read the note. It was all the confirmation Rick needed, but he was still waiting for the man to write his reply. The man's shoulders shook, and he started crying in earnest once he read Rick's note. He nodded and wrote down, "He has my daughter." Rick thought hard. This was a difficult situation, and he could only think of one solution. He quickly explained his plan to James. The younger police officer frowned and shook his head. "You can't do that," James said. "It goes against protocol, and you don't even know this guy is telling the truth. It could all be a lie." "I believe him," Rick replied, "and this is the only plan we've got. Alert dispatch of my orders." Rick leaned in close to the driver. "Sir, I'm going to get into the car with you. Right now, I ask you to continue to follow the man's instructions and trust us to help you. My partner will follow us." Rick climbed into the passenger seat and signaled the man to continue driving. He pulled away, and they drove in silence. Rick was alert the entire time. Once or twice, he heard muted shuffles and whimpers from the trunk, but it didn't seem like the man there had caused any harm to the driver's daughter yet. As they entered the Baltimore suburbs, Rick thought over the next stage of his plan. This was the part where the situation might turn dangerous very fast. He needed to be careful if he was going to resolve this mess without letting anyone get hurt. Rick glanced at the driver. The man was a mess. He worried that the driver might take some risky action to save his daughter. Unfortunately, Rick couldn't even calm the man down because the armed man in the trunk might hear it. A few minutes later, the driver turned into a driveway. The house was dark. The driver signaled to Rick, and he nodded. This must be the place where he was supposed to stop. Rick and the driver exited the vehicle. Then Rick signaled the man. Rick lowered himself to the ground and climbed under the car. He drew his service weapon and tilted his head to see the gunman's feet once he climbed out. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as he watched the driver circle around to open the trunk. Rick knew his timing would have to be perfect. Sam's fingers shook as he popped the latch on the trunk. He was terrified of what he might find in there and what might happen next. The gunman burst out when the trunk was open and dragged Tamara out behind him. Sam looked in horror as the gunman tightened his grip on Tamara and wheeled around. He held his gun ready to fire as he studied the area. "Come out, whoever you are," the gunman called. "I heard 2 doors slam shut when we stopped. If this moron's here, then that means another moron is hiding somewhere." "No, there's nobody else here," Sam said. "That was me. I closed the door twice because I didn't do it properly the first time." "Liar," the gunman raised his weapon. "If your friend doesn't come out, your daughter gets it." Sam felt the world crumbling around him. His situation was impossible. There were no correct choices here. He was starting to think that nothing he did would save Tamara. His daughter would die, and he'd have to watch it, knowing he was helpless to save her. "Okay," the policeman called from his hiding spot beneath the car. "I'm going to come out nice and easy. Just calm down." Sam watched the gunman's eyes widen as the policeman emerged. Then he tightened his grip on the gun, and his face hardened into a scowl. "You got the police involved?" he said. "That was a big mistake." The gunman herded Sam, Tamara, and the policeman into the house through a door that opened into the kitchen. The gunman then rummaged through the drawers with one hand while keeping his sight trained on the trio. Eventually, he pulled out a package of cable ties and secured the trio to the dining room chairs. "You ruined everything, man," he said as he tightened Sam's bonds. "I was going to let you go, but now you got the cops involved. I ought to pop you." "Your life is over if you do that," the policeman said. "My backup will be here any minute." The gunman let out a cry of rage. He shoved the policeman so hard that he fell over in his chair, and then the gunman raced out of the kitchen. "Are you okay?" Sam asked the policeman. Before he could reply, the hostages heard a loud crash echo through the house. Sam thought his eyes must be deceiving him when an elderly lady brandished a shovel entered the kitchen. "More intruders? I'll knock your heads just like I did to your friend," she cried and rushed toward them with her shovel held high. "No, we're hostages," Sam yelled. "The man on the floor is a police officer." The elderly lady lowered her shovel and peered at the policeman. Once she saw Sam was telling the truth, she quickly untied them all. While Sam embraced Tamara, the old lady led the policeman to the gunman she'd knocked unconscious. Rick immediately removed his gun and handcuffed the man. While they waited for Rick's backup to arrive, the elderly lady told them she'd recently moved into the house. She purchased it cheaply because it belonged to a thief imprisoned for life. Rick then revealed that the roadblock was to try and apprehend a man who'd escaped from a courthouse holding cell. A few days later, Sam and the elderly lady received medals for their bravery. Sam felt he didn't deserve it, insisting that a brave man would have fought the gunman. Rick, who'd become friends with Sam, had a different opinion. Things would have ended badly if you'd fought him, Rick said. Your daughter is alive today because you chose to play it safe and had the courage to see it through. What happened with this man in the next story will melt our hearts. Paul is depressed after being dismissed from service following severe injuries. But when he sees a burial flag during one of his routine rounds as a garbage collector, he does not realize he's stepping into the new beginning of the rest of his life. Paul had had a rough past year. Only a couple of years back, he'd been climbing the army ranks fast, but an ambush in the war zone had seen him sustain severe injuries on his legs. He was soon dismissed from the army on medical grounds. From there, his life began on a downward spiral. He sunk into depression, yet life did not stop for him. Paul had to sustain himself, and the only job he could find was working for the city as a garbage man. He was determined to stay afloat, and he took his job seriously. "Stop for a second," Paul said abruptly, forcing the garbage truck driver to come to a sudden stop. They were doing their rounds around the estates collecting garbage. "What is it, Paul?" wondered Owen, staring intently ahead. They stopped in front of a newly renovated house, and Paul could make out what seemed to be a burial flag hanging from a dumpster. "I hope that's not what I think it is," he said, quickly grabbing the door handle and jumping out. He bolted towards the dumpster and couldn't believe it when he realized what he'd seen was indeed a burial flag. How could anyone have so much disrespect for a man that served his country to his last breath? Paul muttered under his breath. Upon close inspection, he found a display case right under the flag. He seemed to recognize the name engraved on the case. James. Paul and James had been deployed to the South after the war broke out, and he tearfully remembered how James had saved his life on the battlefield. Paul was falling in love with the young woman, and it seemed like a dream far out of reach to imagine himself with her. After all, it was barely a day since they met. Even though Paul left the battlefield severely wounded, so much so that his dismissal from service was imminent, he was grateful to James for saving his life. It shocked him that James was dead, but at that moment, he was more concerned that James's family could disrespect him so much that they threw away his burial flag. That evening, as he sat in his apartment, Paul could not suppress the bitter taste in his mouth. He was determined to find where his colleague was buried and pay him some respect. He turned on the old computer in the corner of his shabby apartment and began searching the archives. Hours later, he struck his luck. Veterans Day was quickly approaching, and Paul planned on visiting James's grave and paying tribute to the man that had saved his life years ago. It could have been minutes or even hours, but he was caught up in the moment that he did not hear footsteps approaching. He became startled when he suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, saw the silhouette of a woman in the corner of his eye. He turned to see a young woman standing beside him. "So sorry I didn't see you there," he stammered, offering a hand in greeting. "I'm Paul." "Hi, I'm Susan, James's sister. Are you the one who brought back my brother's flag? Did you know him?" The words stumbled out of her mouth. "Yes, James was my colleague, and I found the flag in a dumpster," he answered, staring straight ahead. Susan narrated how they had recently moved and lost the flag, and for the first time in weeks, Paul felt relieved that James's family had not intentionally thrown away the flag. That evening, as Paul sat surrounded by Susan's family, he couldn't explain the sparks in his heart. His eyes were fixated on Susan, and he was almost sure his cheeks were red from embarrassment. He was falling in love with the young woman, and it seemed like a dream far out of reach to imagine himself with her. After all, it was barely a day since they met. However, that was not his only worry. He knew people that had fallen in love within minutes, and it had lasted a lifetime. His main concern was that he collected garbage for a living. Would Susan accept him with that kind of a job, he wondered? He waited until Susan carried the dishes to the kitchen and offered to help. Once they were out of everyone's earshot, Paul confessed. Look, Susan, I know we only met today, but I think I'm in love with you. Susan stood there saying nothing, but Paul could read every one of her emotions from her huge, pretty eyes. Now, this is not a call for action, and I know you may not feel the same way, especially given my line of work, but I thought I was crazy for feeling this way, she screamed, jumping into Paul's arms. They hugged for a while, each unable to detach themselves from the warmth of their newly discovered affections. Oh, and don't worry about working as a garbage man. I've been looking for a trustworthy person to overlook my employees at my shop in the city, she said matter-of-factly. I'm sure you're the perfect fit for the job. 6 months later, people were streaming into the small garden wedding to witness the marriage between Paul and Susan. The past 6 months had been something from a storybook. Paul was finally happy, and with Susan in his life, depression was a thing of the past. They exchanged rings as their family and friends looked on, and as Paul slid that ring on Susan's finger, he couldn't help but think that even as James lay in his grave, he had once again saved his life.